Hello, class. We're going to continue in this part 3 of chapter 41. We're going to look at the purchase of assets. So in contrast to the merger and consolidation that we looked at in the previous 2 parts of this chapter's videos, we're going to be looking here at the purchase of assets. And one of the really attractive things about the purchase of assets is that there's no shareholder approval required. So it doesn't take as much process to work through for a corporation. All right. And it sounds fairly straightforward. It's a sales transaction. All right. The thing that could be a little tricky with the purchase of assets is that there's a possibility that the seller is actually trying to do something other than just make a straightforward sale of the assets of the corporation. It's possible that the seller may actually be trying to disguise a merger of sorts, and in that way avoid perhaps paying the liabilities. All right, so this is why we spend a little time on this. I mean, the purchase of assets is not that tough a concept to understand. It's about looking, however, at the facts and trying to determine, is there really a purchase of assets, or could it be a possible merger, a disguised merger? All right, so there are 4 situations, 4 exceptional situations in which it has been recognized that the so-called purchase is actually, in fact, a merger and should be treated like a merger. All right, so what are those 4 exceptions? All right, the first one is if in the facts of the situation, it's possible that the acquiring corporation, the purchaser, has impliedly or expressly assumed the seller's liabilities. And as an example of a case, your book includes case in point 41.4 called American Standard. And as happens sometimes, this particular case is what I call a negative example. It doesn't really show us a case where the court found that there was some language in the contract, or there's some implied agreement that the purchaser would take the liabilities, assume the liabilities, but they found the opposite. All right, so in this particular case, there was a written contract, and the phrase used in the contract was the phrase Kewanee liabilities, Kewanee being one of the companies involved. All right, and did the actual disputed liability fall within that phrase, Kewanee liabilities? And the court said it did. The court found no evidence of fraud or any other possible facts to point that this was really intended to be a merger and not a purchase. And so the court held for the companies that merged, that the new company that took on the assets, that it was not responsible for the liability that came after the transaction. All right. The second possible set of facts that might occur is that the sale is in fact a merger or a consolidation, even though not called that. But essentially, it's become a de facto merger or consolidation. All right, that's the phrase that the courts will use. Let's look at the third and fourth exceptions. All right, the third exception is if there are facts that indicate that the acquiring corporation continues the seller's business and retains the same personnel. And what by personnel, we're talking about high-level, managerial level personnel, not your average, factory floor worker or the administrative staff in the management offices. We're talking about staff that has made decisions and basically are the leaders of the corporation. All right, so if you see those kind of facts occurring, that there are a number of high-level management personnel that transfer over to the purchasing corporation. If you see some of the same or even most of the same business going on within the acquiring corporation's business, then you might be able to argue that in fact what's happened is we have a merger more than we have a purchase. All right. And then the fourth possibility is that the actual sale itself was born of this desire to defraud the creditors. All right. So if you see that the selling corporation had a lot of debt at the time it sold its assets off, and usually there'll be some facts that kind of really point you that way. Maybe a judgment comes down and then they like sell off all their assets, or a judgment, not even a judgment, maybe they get sued. And so only the complaint has been served and then they go and sell off all their major assets. That's a little fishy, isn't it? That's the kind of thing that we're talking about here. It looks like they're acting fraudulently. We use those facts and then we can say the purchase, so-called purchase, is in fact a merger. Of course, we'd have to argue that, and we'd have to get the court to believe us and to agree with us on that. All right. So we're going to take a look now at a business scenario problem. It is problem 41-2, and I'm going to switch out to your textbook to do this. And this particular problem, 41-2, it will give us an example of point number 2 here, how there's a de facto merger. And point number 3, it'll give us some facts where we see the business being carried out by the acquiring corporation. I believe we might also find a little evidence of number 4 where there's a bit of fraud. All right, but let me switch out to the textbook and get 41-2 up here on the screen. Here it is, right? And this, I believe, is a case based on a real lawsuit. All right. I know there's no citation here. The authors did not include it, but I believe when I originally read this, years ago, it is based on a real case. All right. Excuse me, class. All right, sorry. All right, now let me read this for you. Paradise Pools, Inc., PPI, entered into a contract with Vittorio LLP to build a pool as part of a hotel being developed by Takahashi Development. PPI built the pool, but Vittorio, the general contractor, defaulted on other parts of the project. Takahashi completed the construction. Litigation followed, and Takahashi was awarded $18,656 against PPI. Meanwhile, Paradise Corp, or PC, was incorporated with the same management as PPI, but different shareholders. All right. PC acquired PPI's assets without assuming its liabilities and soon became known as Paradise Pools and Spas. Takahashi sought to obtain a writ of garnishment against PC to enforce the judgment against PPI. All right, is PC, that's the new company, all right, liable for PPI's obligation to Takahashi, and why or why not? All right, so you've got to take a look at this overall and take note of the facts that can be used or are important to us in our discussion of the purchase of assets and whether it should be recognized as a bona fide purchase or can it be challenged, all right, and argued that it is in fact a merger, all right. So in this situation, we see the default on that construction project, and then we see the litigation and the award to Takahashi against PPI. All right. Now, at or about the same time as this award or during that lawsuit while it was pending, that's when the new company was created. And guess what? It has the same management as the original company, the company that is liable on the judgment, PPI. Right? The only kind of caveat here would be the shareholders. The owners are different. but we don't know exactly who the original shareholders are and who the new shareholders or the shareholders of the new corporation are. They could be related parties as well, related somehow. They don't have to necessarily be the same exact parties, but that may not be enough that they are different shareholders to keep this from being described as a merger and not a purchase. All right. Uh, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. All right. And the other thing to take a look at here is look at the name of the companies, right? Original company's name is Paradise Pools Inc. The new company created is Paradise Corp. And how does it do business? Its business name is Paradise Pools and Spas. All right. All very similar. All right. Again, kind of, pointing at the fact that these could be one and the same company, PPI and PC, who is doing business as Paradise Pools and Spas. So I think, overall, looking at the facts, the court could have very good reason to find that even though it's called a purchase of assets on paper, this could very well be a merger of the two companies, of Paradise Pools or a consolidation. Sorry, misspoke there. Coming in, selling it off, but really, in fact, just taking ownership again. All right, so merger or consolidation. All right, so let me see. It's important, all right, important for you to have a way to look at these type of transactions and being able to recognize what is happening within them. Right. I'm going to end right here, and we'll pick up in part 4 with the purchase of stock.